this morning.
Always a pleasure, always a pleasure. We are in a very cloudy day in Mogoditshane Block 9. Where are you joining us from?
I'm also under the same conditions, but in Cape Town, attending a conference because the work does not end.
Oh, Motamedi, you haven't had time to relax and, recover after this, I would say, ordeal that you've been through?
I think, yeah, it really doesn't end because when you look at inequities and injustices, at the end of the day, you have to continue, regardless of whether you are able to get rest or not. But yes, what you're mentioning is very important. We need to rest and recuperate. One's greatest asset is the body.
Why should I take a holiday? A
Yeah.
person must be wondering, who is this person that Anthony's talking to? So, Jimmy, could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my name is Dumiso Gatsha. I was standing as an independent candidate, Mokoko, for Parliament for the Mogoditshane West Constituency. And I think for me, it's just also recognizing that that candidacy was a continuation of the work that I've and then more importantly that despite the failure, it's a significant milestone, especially because only 2 independent candidates have ever won in our entire 58-year in the history of independence, and that those wins are 2 decades apart. So it's quite eye-opening to sort of learn that reality, and so I'm very happy for that. And obviously congratulations to yourself in your own candidacy as a councillor.
Thank you, thank you. But today is all about you. With the history of knowing that only one ever independent candidate has actually ever won a seat in Parliament, why then did you decide to run and set yourself up with this peculiar and almost impossible task?
So I actually didn't know the statistics, unfortunately, which is good. But I think for me, it was about trying to bring human rights to Parliament. I mean, I was very bothered, for example, with the flurry of bills that were skewed towards not only increasing power of the sitting president, but also benefiting from, I guess, the majority in Parliament being able to vote so that there can be economic benefits at a personal level. I think also one other, which is a shared sentiment with many other Botswana, with all the issues that came as a result of patronage and corruption, or alleged corruption, if I can put it that way. And then more prominently for me, and at a personal level, is just looking at how difficult it was to advance human rights, citizen participation, accountability, understanding, and grassroots interest whenever we're meeting with the heads of delegation, whether it is at the United Nations in New York or Geneva, or the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, or the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And so I think for me, it's just recognizing that it was very, very difficult, at least at a civil society level, to get certain inroads and wins. And so the hope was that Kamayamabo Parlamente would go much further, and particularly for a constituency that is key to my heart, having grown up there and seeing some of the challenges being quite the same. And I think for me, it is embarrassing for a democratic country to still have the same kinds of conditions, 30 decades later from when I was an infant. It's still embarrassing that you can't say that that is part of Greater Gaborone, a capital city in a higher middle income country, when people still don't necessarily have water, when people still have land rights issues, and many others. And so I think for me, it was recognizing that there's a need to broadly address human rights and sustainable development. And because my activism couldn't go as far, the hope was that at least as a parliamentary member, that would be far much different and hopefully a lot more impactful.
Nice. So you're basically bringing civil society into issues of governance where they are going to be, where basically all these decisions are being made, right? Could you tell us why not through a political party? Like, why specifically going directly to the source of power?
Yeah. So I think also the assumption is that civil society is always just an NGO, right? But I think we know that civil society includes cooperatives, it includes media, it includes different stakeholders. And so I think that's very important. I think for me, it's about being of the people by the people. And so in a political party system, the reality is that a political party subscribes to certain ideologies. A political party usually has a specific leader who obviously sets the tone, the parameters, and the scope in which that leader would allow their representatives across the country to push for whatever issues. And so I think for me, there was a consistent conflict of the interests of Mogoditshane West versus the interests of a political party. And the indivisibility of human rights is really saying that, we are independent of a political establishment. People could no longer trust a political establishment. People could no longer move towards the interests of a political establishment because I think we've seen the implications thereof. And so I think for me, in recognizing the need to be independent, it was literally to stand as independent. And I think it can be tempting because I even had, different political party councillors wanting to sort of share a ticket, so to speak. And I think for me, it's just sort of speaking to the ability to work with everyone and not be limited. And I think more importantly, you are diluting power, the concentration of power, by making sure that there's an element of independence within the context of politics. And I think maybe more ultimately, the personal really is political, right? A lot of the choices that people might assume are not related to politics are actually directly linked to politics. What we consume, how information is interpreted and relayed, you're taking an actual political position. And as a feminist, it is a political choice.
What are some of the lessons that you learned from running, particularly as an independent candidate? Is it something that you'd advise a person to do?
For me, I think it is a citizen's right, and it's important to encourage young people to, take up the mantle and the challenge for it. It is physically, mentally taxing. You find that we would knock off at 2 a.m., 1 a.m. after, regrouping and thinking and reflecting on the day. And I think also, it's for a lot of conversations, we couldn't even start with a human rights conversation because it was also about bread and butter issues. We must acknowledge that people were experiencing and are still experiencing socioeconomic inequities. People are underemployed, people are unemployed, people are going through many challenges, not just from an economic lens, but also even in the context of some of the interpersonal relationships that they have, in terms of inadequate service delivery, in terms of not necessarily getting some of the needs that they need when turning to their elected or traditional leaders. And so I think for me, it was very, very eye-opening because you then got to appreciate what is happening. Normally in the context of my activism, we'll be focusing maybe on health, we'll be focusing on HIV, we'll be focusing on sexual reproductive health and rights. And so now it was very, very different because it wasn't necessarily about queer rights now. It was literally talking about the livelihoods of people. What are the conditions when parents are being sent curricula via WhatsApp and a teacher doesn't have the necessary equipment in the context of textbooks, or there's no printing paper, but then also what happens for a parent who doesn't have a phone that has WhatsApp. So these were things that, in as much as they are basic dignities, they were often denied. And I think for me, preparation for this candidacy, I also reviewed quite a lot of recommendations that had been made by the IEC. And they noted, elements of voter apathy and obviously questionable issues that that were presented as recommendations for the IEC to improve on, which embarrassingly, I think only 5 or so were being worked on out of the 19 recommendations. Nonetheless, it spoke about voter apathy, and there was a legitimacy to that voter apathy because there weren't enough credible options, there weren't enough, manifestos or ideas or, ideologies that people could back or understand. And then also just the fact that it was very difficult to know who's the current incumbent. And so that discouraged a lot of people. And so I think for me, it was just being able to see in real time the very fabric of society and what that means. And I think for me, what I appreciate the most is being able to engage with Botswana. And, obviously now different demographics, because I wasn't just focusing on young people like I normally do. And it was really, really alarming for me to see how many people with disabilities are across the constituency, and how many people actually need home-based care. So there were just so many things that for me, I didn't think I would ever be aware of beyond just maybe the infrastructural issues. So I think I really value that experience. I really value that time.
Let's go to the element of democracy. Do you have a better view of Botswana's democracy now, especially now considering the election results, and what do you get from that?
I don't think better, but I think it's affirmed for me because I've always believed that democracy is not just about a vote, right? Democracy is about civic action. It's about civic participation. It's about leaving no one behind. It's about everyone having a voice. And appreciating our dualist legal system meant that, Botswana had opportunities to engage, if not in some of the more formal or different variants of the three arms of government, some form of participation, whether it's seeking justice, whether it's engaging in a consultation, process that maybe Parliament might have, or a parliamentary member might have. It would possibly be through the quota system. And now, at least from just some of my own observations at an activist level, we realize that not as many young people, particularly diverse young people, were accessing the quota system. Not as many, survivors of injustice were accessing, court systems. And so I think, they were not able to get redress, at least in a timely manner. And in some instances, it'll be very difficult to get assistance from law enforcement. So I think for me, it's just the appreciation of a lot of things that I had obviously learned in theory, practiced in the context of community development and activist work. And then now it was more full circle in recognizing the ultimate litmus and the ultimate definition of a democracy through the election process. And I think just going through that from, the registration, trying to get a logo approved, and it was very telling. And all I can say is that ultimately, it's really a pity that our infrastructure, our electoral process is built around political parties. Because I think in the more matured democracies that we've seen globally, it's really a multi-party system. It's a negotiated government, which at least means that there's a lot of representation, there's a lot of different interests, even those that might not necessarily be ideal for human rights, but ultimately it really is reflecting the will of the people. And a government by and for the people is what we truly want in a democracy.
Nice. So you mentioned that one of the challenges was that the electoral system is built around parties. What are some of the challenges that you encountered during your run? Not necessarily relating specifically to politics or the IEC, but just generally around, and how did you overcome them?
So obviously it's resourcing. I mean, resourcing for, banners and, the nice thing and the branding. And then more important.
Do you want to share how much you actually spent on your campaign?
I won't even be able to detect that. It would be very difficult. But yeah, maybe I'll try estimate a little later. So I think, just looking at how whenever information was needed, it wasn't necessarily available, particularly from the IEC. It was very difficult even accessing and trying to get information. And sometimes it wouldn't necessarily be consistent compared to, for example, the office in Mogoditshane headquarters, and even telephonically when speaking to an officer or one of the employees who's supposed to assist. I think, it's a bit disjarring that after a 5-year cycle, you'd assume that there would be preparation. But I think everyone knew and saw, how that was quite unfortunate. I think also, just being able to approach the voter can be quite difficult. Botswana aren't always the nicest to approach in public. And I understand, because sometimes they might think you're Jehovah's Witness, or, you're someone who's trying to solicit something or ask for donations. So it's very interesting, and it's dynamic. And I think it's not even unique to elections when trying to engage Botswana. I think another element is the fact that, sometimes you then realize that people have a lot of needs and a lot of issues, and they aren't consistently heard. And so you find that people definitely want to grieve, want to express their frustrations, want to relay their anger on any individual who is willing to listen and who's willing to stand, which I think is really quite important, and a sentiment that really reflected how frustrated not just voters, but Botswana overall are. I think another element is just the fact that, it's very difficult to obviously identify who is registered and who isn't registered. And so how do you then tailor make, in as much as, yes, you want to focus on the entire constituency, to some extent with limited resources, you'd also want to target those who are registered to vote. And so I think it's just recognizing that there are significant.
I feel like one of the dirty little secrets that people don't know is that once the registration process is done and you're not a registered voter, you're basically invisible to politicians because you're not
Yes.
useful at that point.
Yeah.
People need to understand you've lost all power for the next 5 years.
But I mean, also more importantly, it's, you know, in as much as the vote is powerful in that moment, it's not the only thing that you have power over. I think Botswana in general need to recognize that they do have power. They have power to call on and call to account their elected members. They have the power to get information. They have the right, not even the power, it's the right. You're entitled to the right to participating in the trajectory, in the development, and in the governance of this country. And I think for me, it's recognizing that, yes, the starting point is the vote, but now the work is, can you then get your parliamentarian, get your councillor to account for the progress that they've made with the electoral processes? Can they make sure that they're engaging you whenever there's a new law, whenever there's something that's happening, or whenever there's a public concern?
So our last question, it's day 15, I think, of the new government. A full cabinet hasn't yet been announced, but what are your opinions of the new government so far and your expectations?
I think I will say, obviously, it is maybe a little bit concerning, just based off the different narratives that practices that were done, or the ways in which appointments were made by the previous ruling party are, you know, obviously done at this point. Secondly, that you know, there are many women in their diversity who I assume have always expressed interest to run, who maybe might not have had the opportunity to run, because we know that there's care work, we know that resourcing is an issue because of, you know, gender parities in economic standing. And so I think for me, it's wanting to see women on the ground, wanting to see young mothers who can be appointed, you know, people who don't necessarily have privilege, people who would be an ordinary person that we can bump into Mogoditshane, because they're just as equipped and just as qualified, because they're also graduates. And so I think for me, it's wanting to see the appointment of people who have not had the proximity to power.
So are you not convinced the appointment there, Honorable Chombo?
Oh no, I think in fact she said it nicely in the context of if not now, when, you know? And I think for me it's literally just making sure that it's not only just one young person. I think the problem is that we always make an assumption that one person is enough. But let us remember that young people are a majority in this country, firstly and foremost. And secondly, I think for me it's really about an equitable approach. When someone can literally succeed anyway, that is all good and well, which is amazing. But let's not forget those individuals who, you know, haven't had the same kinds of opportunities, who wouldn't necessarily even have the same kinds of privileges, you know, in terms of sustained income, access to power, and so forth. And so I think for me, as a grassroots activist, it's the belief that you can get someone, you know, from Kachikau to come and help govern, because in many instances, the requirements aren't necessarily looking at formal education. And I think we must start valuing lived experiences. We must start, you know, for example, bringing survivors of gender-based violence to help resolve some of the issues and resource them to be empowered. And so obviously one avenue for that is ensuring representation. I think we saw with the previous government that, for example, women representation didn't necessarily equate to meaningful representation and participation, because obviously there were certain things that were very questionable that the members of parliament had expressed in terms of the non-urgency, for example, of GBV.
This has been a very enlightening conversation. Thank you very much for taking the time off, I guess, from being in Cape Town.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Cool.